fundraising appeal and got it. And thanks to all of you who contributed to that. And in the last few months, we've actually seen our membership soar. And that has, of course, happened in the context of the devastating war in Ukraine, because people have recognised Stop the War as being the leading voice for an end to war, arguing not to prolong the conflict, not to bolster the dangerous military alliances, but instead for there to be a negotiated peace that ends the bloodshed in Ukraine and opposes the imperialist powers driving it. We've sustained probably some of the biggest attacks on the anti-war movement in years for our position on this war, which is one that opposes the Russian invasion and calls for immediate withdrawal of troops, and recognises that rooted in this war is the eastward expansion of NATO and the desire of the US to strengthen its influence in Europe, and the rivalry of two nuclear powers who see Ukrainian lives as collateral. But despite the willful misrepresentation and the smears, to the downright dangerous posturing of those who would like to see any critic of NATO cast out as some kind of pariah, comrades, we move. It's been brilliant, actually, to see new groups created, old groups recreated, existing groups re-energized, organising meetings, organising stalls and attending protests, and thousands getting behind our call for an end to the warmongering and for peace in Ukraine. We've always been a campaign which targets our government at home. As British citizens, it's where we have the most leverage in opposing British imperialist adventures abroad, as well as the policies at home that export weapons around the world and deny welcome to the people who those weapons cause to become refugees. Of course, we still comment on and take opposition to what other governments around the world are doing. And in fact, just last night, we joined other campaigns in a demonstration outside the Israeli embassy. And I know we'll all be appalled by what we've seen in Jerusalem and in Gaza in recent days. And I was proud of the role we played over the summer months as well, mobilising some of the largest demonstrations in response to attacks in Sheikh Jarrah, with thousands pouring into cities in solidarity with Palestine. And certainly in London, so many of them, young activists taking to the streets perhaps for the first time and calling for Britain to stop arming Israel. And so too over Yemen, a conflict given so little attention in British media, despite the fact that our own government is now the primary supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia in its brutal war, now in its 7th year. And indeed, while Britain may not be invading new territory, it is certainly becoming poised for it. Our government is making enormous increases in defence spending, the largest rise in 30 years. And this last year's carrier strike group mission to the Indo-Pacific saw the first battle fleet in Asia since the Korean War, including the largest warship Britain has ever sent to sea, all part of the growing Cold War against China. So there remains much to be focusing our efforts on, and I know we'll be discussing our approach to some of those issues today. So I'll leave my own contributions there. But I do want to take this chance again just to say thank you to all our members for contributing so much to this organisation over this last year, whether you were involved at the beginning 20 years ago or you joined in the last few weeks. There would not be an anti-war movement without you. So thank you. I recommend you all do have your AGM packs open throughout the meeting today so that you can follow the agenda and also follow which resolution is being moved at any one time. But before we get on to resolutions, we've got a cracking plenary to kick us off, and I'm really pleased to be joined this afternoon by Lowkey, by Professor Paul Rogers, by Riccardo LaTorre, and our very own Lindsey German. Our first speaker is from one of the many trade unions which affiliates nationally to Stop the War. He's a national officer who leads on, among other things, International for the Fire Brigades Union, and played a leading part in recently seeing the union adopt a position on the war in Ukraine, which echoes our own. It's great to have you join us, Riccardo.
All right, thank you, Shelley. Yeah, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here today. Really glad to come and bring solidarity from the Fire Brigades Union to your conference. You know, STW is an organisation, an incredibly helpful campaign and organisation and resource for workers and trade unionists to be able to navigate some of the issues and the context and the difficulties, which I'm going to touch on there. So, it is an asset to the trade union movement, the work you do, and the things that you publish. And it's that theme really that I want to speak about today. I'm going to base it around the recent Executive Council statement that the Fire Brigades Union released, what Shelly's just mentioned there, and use it to talk more broadly about the role that trade unionists have and that trade unions must have in the call for international peace and justice, and all the while knowing that these aren't easy matters to navigate for workers, for trade union members, for socialists, and especially at the moment, not only is there a sea of propaganda coming at working people from everywhere, there's this very, very strong expectation to just unquestionably back the escalation of war, an escalation of war that only serves to harm working people and our common interests across the world, which I wanted to touch on slightly. And there's been easier statements to put out, I'll be honest, as this one, because I don't have to tell the people at this conference, any straying from that, no expectation, just simply to back escalation, comes with all sorts of accusations of apologism and cowardice and treachery. And it's simply not helpful when trying to analyse the context of the situation, especially from a worker solidarity point of view, at a time when we know working people are dying in their tens, hundreds and thousands, and many more suffering from the wider consequences of conflict. And that's why it's so important that trade unions are at the centre of this discussion, because we can influence that. At a time where we're hearing more call for escalation, we are for peace. Trade unionists, trade union members can influence that conversation amongst workers and therefore amongst wider society. The first point of the FBU statement is clear. As Shelly said, it echoes very much the Stop the War statement. We condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, call for an immediate withdrawal of Russian armed forces. And we particularly send our solidarity to firefighters in Ukraine at the moment. I was a firefighter of 18 years. I, as were all Fire Brigades Union members, shudder at the thought of the circumstances, the situation, the conditions that firefighters are still delivering the humanitarian services, assisting their communities at risk to their own lives and health, which shows yet again that civilians are the prime victims of this conflict. And we are reaching out in practical solidarity to our contacts in the area, but it is difficult because it appears in the first instance that firefighters in Ukraine aren't able to organise. So it is building them links through EPSU, for example, all that more difficult. But the crux of our statement is workers in Ukraine and workers in Russia have common interests, and those interests are not served by this conflict. In the wars of rich men, as we all know, it is working people that lose, it is working people that die, it is working people that struggle, yet all we're hearing for is calls for weapons, and more weapons. And in the same vein, we talk about economic warfare. We go on to say, sanctions will disproportionately affect working people in Russia and more wider. Now, you ask any trade unionist at home, and they'll be able to tell you who feels the struggle when there's any disruption of the flow or the accumulation of wealth. And yet again, it is our class, it is those we share a common interest with. So we have to be a loud and consistent voice calling for peace. We have to be reaching out as trade unionists to build solidarity, particularly in terms of practical solidarity. And that takes me on to another part of the statement, perhaps one of the more and most visible consequences of this conflict and all conflicts, and that's the issue of the millions of people displaced by this and other wars. And I think in that area, the FBU, we have a good record here. We see it as an opportunity to educate, to organise, to reach out and build real solidarity. And prior to the pandemic, and hopefully to resume soon, delegations of FBU members were travelling over to France, to Belgium, visiting refugee camps in solidarity to hear firsthand, to learn the stories and the experiences of these women, men and children who've been displaced by conflict, and not just offering practical solidarity that we could in the camps, take those stories back to our workplaces, have those discussions around our mess tables, counter the propaganda and the scapegoating that is out there, and start having the conversations about the real effect on working people as a result of conflict, countering what we're hearing from our so-called leaders and our media. And I talk about so-called leaders there, and sadly, overhead, I'm not just talking about those in government, I'm talking about those in opposition. We've seen the disgraceful treatment of refugees, hypocritical treatment of refugees from the conflict in Ukraine by our government, but yet that still is a vast improvement on how they're treating refugees from other conflicts and other parts of the world, all the while reinventing or ignoring the role that we and our foreign policy is playing in these conflicts. And in response, a shameful toothlessness from the Labour leadership. And in addition, to shut down any discussion within the Labour Party and to bully and threaten those with different views. And I don't need to tell people at this conference any more about that. You're feeling it firsthand. So in closing, discussion and critical thought by trade unions and our members here at home is vital in the campaign for peace, and in understanding these conflicts in the context. We must consider it as workers, and then only then can we build real solidarity. Workers in Ukraine, workers in Russia, those a repeated theme throughout our statement across the world, have common interests. And even in this appalling situation, we have to stand for workers' unity. We have to stand for internationalism. As the voices in power, as those standing to benefit from these conflicts, are just clamoring for more war at our expense and to their benefit. We must organise to ensure that the voice of trade unions and our members, that we understand the issues and we make sure that our call for peace is a louder one than their call for war. So solidarity. Have a great conference, everyone, and thanks again for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Riccardo. Thanks for all your support and your support from the union as well, and our support to you and the FBU, and look forward to continue working together. Thanks for being here today. Okay, thank you, comrades. Our next speaker is one of the world's leading security experts, the Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, and has written or edited 26 books, including Why We're Losing the War on Terror. He's been writing a weekly Open Democracy column on global security for more than 20 years, offering key analysis, particularly on Ukraine in recent weeks. It's great to have you, Professor Paul Rogers. You should be unmuted now, Paul.
Okay, fully unmuted. Yeah. Thanks very much indeed, Shelley. In fact, the Open Democracy column this week, which was published a couple of hours ago, actually has the sort of title, Is the War at a Dangerous Stalemate? What I was asked to do this morning is just to present an overview of where we are 2 months into the war, which looks like it could last a much longer time. I'll try and do that, and I'll try and do it in 8 minutes. So that's basically 1 point a minute for 8 minutes. So it'll be a fairly brief run through. Let me put it this way. If you go right back to where this started and why it started, back in the 1990s, there was the huge change in the old Soviet Union, and Russia basically had its independent status. You had the period under Yeltsin. During that time, you had this sort of sudden transformation into what you call it market fundamentalism or neoliberalism, the development of a rapid kleptocracy. In many ways, the whole process was really pushed very hard by external characters, not least the IMF and others. The end result was an astonishing economic problem, 2,300% inflation per annum at one point, as turbo and hypercapitalism, call it what you will, came in. Extraordinary, there was actually a 6 to 7 year decrease in life expectancy across Russia as a whole, and something like 1/3 of the entire country ended up in relative poverty. The bigger problem was that in many ways, Russia was treated to a kind of degree of contempt, a kind of end of history thing. We've won, you've lost. And in the process, NATO was able to expand east. The effect of that exists right through to the present day, and one shouldn't underestimate it, particularly among Russians over the age of about 40. Second point, between 2000 and 2021, Putin came in. One of his first tasks was to tame the rampant oligarchs partly by starting off by imprisoning one of the leading ones, Khodorkovsky, and he was able to embed control within the state, using particularly the intelligence and military groups who were so supportive of him. More than that, I think the key thing is that Putin really embraced an idea of a greater Russia leading a new Eurasia. And this is a thinking goes right back to the White Russians in the 1920s, in 1930s and 40s, there was Lev Gumilev, and more recently, of course, you have what you might call the personal advisor of Putin himself, Alexander Dugin. One would have to call the whole process a kind of ethno-nationalist fascism with a touch of actual imperial stardom. Of course, what was required here was to push back against what was seen as the external push, particularly from NATO and indeed from the EU. Basically, Putin's people saw it in very differently. And essentially, the development in Crimea and Donbass in 2014-15 were the start of this. When we come to the start of this war in early 2022, there were very clear war aims from the point of view of Putin. The requirement was to take Kyiv at a very early stage and engineer a termination of the regime. Air supremacy over the whole country had to be gained. And essentially, it was necessary to really consolidate the whole hold over Donbass. This whole process failed almost from the start. And in fact, Ukraine resistance was far higher. The Russian military tended to be very big, but basically disorganized. And there's really no welcome from the Ukrainians at all as expected. So within 4 days, you have a very, I suppose you could say, an annoyed, frustrated Putin, even threatening escalation to a new level. Since that point forward, we've seen the slow transition over about 4 to 6 weeks to more of a counter-city war with an emphasis on the south and the southeast. Now the aim is clearly to consolidate control of Donbass through to Crimea at whatever cost. And we're seeing a huge cost, particularly the examples being Mariupol. Point 5, we're now in this unstable stalemate. NATO is supporting in all kinds of ways. There are floods of weapons going in, and what we're moving now to, I will call a hybrid state-on-state come proxy war, which is in many ways extremely dangerous. The problem is that Putin, from his perspective, can't afford to lose, but neither, of course, can NATO. And I think within NATO thinking, particularly among the hawks, this is almost a golden opportunity to cripple Russia in the longer term and even damage China. That is not a view right across the West, but there are elements within that. Point 6, what are the position from Putin at the present time? He has very limited options. One, obviously, is to declare victory, whatever he has achieved, and negotiate. And the extraordinary thing is that even now, the Ukrainian government is prepared to negotiate and even to compromise. If he doesn't do that, he can basically hunker down with what is going on now in Donbass and try and wear out NATO and Ukraine resolve and then do a deal. That too is unlikely. He could go for broke and try and take Donbass and the whole of the south of the country. But really, I think one has to be very cautious about that, given the failure so far. And finally, of course, there is the risk of threatening escalation. And we've seen that already to some extent. But the problem with this, of course, is you always have to figure in this kind of crisis that 3-point phenomenon, AIM, accidents, incidents, and mavericks. And that is the risk of unexpected escalation. It makes the situation really very dangerous. So Putin still has weak points. The support from China isn't guaranteed. There are internal rivalries between the military and the intelligence agencies, and Russia has severe casualties, probably 15,000 soldiers killed and maybe 30,000 seriously injured, and that is having an impact. So we're basically this big stalemate. It's going to be extremely difficult to get out of it, but I'll end up with 2 big points which have to be remembered. First, this is classically time of now thrive the armorers. This is good times for NATO, particularly the hawks, and for military industrial complexes everywhere, right across the world, including in Russia. The bad times are for pacifists and war critics, but we have to be resolute in maintaining our criticisms and suggesting possible alternatives. And remember, NATO itself has been party to 4 failed wars in recent years. And the total cost of wars over the last 20 years, nearly 1 million dead, 387,000 civilians killed, 38 million people displaced, and an $8 trillion cost. So point there, the wars fail. Big point 2, The problem is this is actually occurring in a globally evolving triple crisis. That is the crisis, of course, of neoliberalism, plus limits to growth, plus a military system which is predicated on using military force. We're in a very fluid and unpredictable state in world politics, and we basically have to keep our resolve. All I would say is that security alternatives are never more needed than they are now. So to that extent, a movement like Stop the War is critically important. I'm not sure whether I've kept to the time, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. No, it was impeccably timed, actually. Thank you so much for that. And I've just posted the link to the article that you referenced there, for people to have a look at your writing, which is really helpful. Thanks once again. Next, we're joined by one of Stop the War's patrons, a key supporter over many years and an important voice on Palestine, the war on terror and international solidarity. His album Soundtrack to the Struggle is exactly that, and there is hardly a protest worth going to without him. Rapper, writer, activist and academic. And can I express our utmost solidarity to you amid the atrocious attacks and the efforts to try and silence you and your music at the moment. They will not be successful. Lowkey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Shelly. It's great to be here. You know, 19 years ago, you saw the invasion of Iraq. It's estimated by some that 36 million people across the globe, about 3,000 demonstrations were counted, protested against this war. It was a war that displaced 1 in 25 Iraqis and is believed to have killed over 1 million people. Since the beginning of that war, you had the United States spending $32 million an hour. Now, Stop the War and the movement against war in this country is one of the vital campaigns which a sort of permanent policy seeks to suppress. For example, 77% of the UK public support a ban on nuclear weapons globally. Is that reflected within our political system? 77% of the public want nationalization of energy. Is that reflected in the political system? 76% want the railways in public ownership. 83% want water in public ownership. Where is the reflection in our political system of these kind of ideas? Now, it's worth mentioning, as others have alluded to before me, that the very week that Russia launched the operation in Ukraine, Saudi Arabia carried out dozens of strikes on Yemen. Israel launched deadly missile attacks on Syria, and the United States restarted a bombing campaign in Somalia, which had been on and off since 2007. When we look at the coverage on mainstream US platforms from Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, they had in that first week 1,300 separate stories on the Ukraine invasion. They only had 2 stories on the Syria attack, 1 on Somalia, and none at all on the Saudi-led war on Yemen. And the important thing to know is that in the middle of that week, 37 separate airstrikes were recorded on one day by the Saudis on Yemen. And just so we understand the scope of what has happened there, according to the United Nations, by the end of 2021, we were looking at 377,000 people believed to already have died from the war in Yemen, a war which Britain is deeply implicated in. That even, you know, the Daily Mail reported British special forces being injured there, the implication being that Britain are active on the ground, are a direct and active participant in the war. Of course, in that first 5 days of war, you saw BAE Systems have the price of their shares rise by 21%. Of course, Stop the War will be subject to attack from those within the establishment who are deeply entwined with the common sense ideas around war. You know, Keir Starmer is someone that's funded by Clive Hollick, a director of Honeywell International. Honeywell International claims to have its hardware present in virtually every defense aircraft in the world. That's what it says on its own website. He's also funded by Trevor Chin, who was a key Israel lobbyist in this country. In fact, the only Labour MP who received more funding from Trevor Chin was Tom Watson. We also have to remember that, you know, when Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions, he met with the head of the MI5 for informal social drinks in April 2013. And that was just the year after he had ruled not to prosecute the MI5 for its role in rendition and torture. We also know that he previously was a member of the Trilateral Commission, which its connections with US intelligence are very well documented. We also know that he met with US Attorney General Eric Holder in 2011 at the very same time that he was handling the Julian Assange case as a public prosecutor. Keir Starmer's opposition to stop the war is indicative of the wider establishment war against, number one, the public's right to know how their money is being spent in harming other people in the world, but number two, in a war against the public's ability to actually have a say about foreign policy. Of course, when we look back at the Labour Party, we don't have to look any further than what happened to Keir Hardie. When he opposed World War I and he made the argument, you know, against the small nations argument, he said, you know, Britain, how was Britain supposed to protect the neutrality of Belgium when Belgium occupied Congo and had responsibility for some of the most horrific crimes there? He was lambasted and lied about in the press and nicknamed Keir von Hardie, with claims that he was a German agent. Doesn't that sound familiar? The leader of the Labour Party being depicted as a foreign agent merely for opposing war. We obviously, going further back, have the example of Ramsay MacDonald and the Genevieve letter, which, you know, it's been documented by Jonathan Pyle in his book, Churchill's Secret Enemy, that the letter had been the creation of Sir George Joseph Bull, and, you know, at the time he was a long-serving MI5 officer, and of course the Genevieve letter had been a forgery, implying that the election of Ramsay MacDonald would bring Britain closer to the Soviet Union. Of course, we have the example of Harold Wilson and the mobilization against him with Operation Clockwork Orange, which came out that the intelligence services were collecting smears on the Prime Minister, who was in government at the time, and that they were passing out that information through cooperative journalists. What we are facing is a major war, and the direction it is coming from is the state. And unfortunately, the ramifications of what may be achieved during this time, future generations will suffer from. If we are in a position where the British state is able to neutralize anti-war activism in this country, then we will have no ability going forward to oppose the wars in future. There won't even be alternative sources of information easily and readily available for people through which they can try to understand what exactly is happening in the world. Now we are essentially, and those like us, are being cleansed from the right to have political subjectivity. You have had people losing membership in the Labour Party, you've had people losing their jobs, you've even at least had one person attempting suicide. There's been death threats targeted towards people who have been subjected to these kind of processes in the Labour Party. But also at the same time, and a very dangerous process is taking place, which is the intertwining of the war industries and the war machine on one side, but also the very important functions of the state on the other side. So what I mean by that is you look at a company like Kinetic. So Ben Wallace, our defense secretary, the same month that he became an MP, he actually resigned from his job as overseas director of the arms tech firm Kinetic. Now, Kinetic has a long-term agreement with the Ministry of Defense to manage 17 different sites. It's worth about £6 billion. One of its directors, Gordon Messenger, is on the Defense Reform Advisory Board to Ukraine. Now, that is simultaneous to him leading the government review into the NHS to drive up efficiency. Now, we know that according to Kinetic's evidence at the Select Committee on Health in 2005, it has long sought to entrench its tech into the NHS as a way to improve efficiency. We also have, the examples of Palantir, the CIA spy tech firm, which cut its teeth in the war on terror, being given access to NHS data. I know there is a semi-successful fight back to that. We also have the example of the very company which employed the interrogators at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, who are widespread pictures of major abuses to prisoners at Abu Ghraib. Khaki International. Not only was this company not held accountable in any way, shape, or form, it then 4 years later got the contract to deliver the Scottish census. In addition to that, you had Lockheed Martin as interrogators in Guantanamo Bay, later going on to get the contract for the UK census. We also have now the English Channel being put under the command of the Navy, led by particular figures who had significant roles in the war on terror. This is about the entwining of our society with all types of aspects of the war machine. And it is absolutely important that while that is happening, we have an effective anti-war movement which is able to not only call that out, but is able to organize and mobilize against those efforts within our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lowkey. Thank you for that, and thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting us. And I've posted a link in there to the petition so people can support you as well. Our final speaker needs no introduction in this room, but she is very deserving of one. A friend and a comrade and a mentor to many, Britain's premier anti-war activist, a co-founder of Stop the War, and our convener, Lindsey German. Lindsey.
Thanks very much, Shelley, and thanks to all the previous speakers. I think it's given a brilliant different aspects of the nature of this war, and I particularly in terms of what Lowkey said a bit early on, in terms of the danger to what is being attempted against the anti-war movement, which is to stop not just opposition to what our government's doing over Ukraine at the moment and what NATO's doing, but also to stop opposition to future wars. And I think that the importance of the anti-war movement, we know, has been substantial, that while we didn't stop the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, we did have a huge effect on public opinion. I believe that effect on public opinion is still there. And this gives you some background to the reason why we're under such attack now, that we're being accused of apologists for Putin and all the other kind of things that we've been accused of. And I think that this war in Ukraine is obviously a war which is a different situation for the anti-war movement in two major respects. Firstly, that the invasion has not been by our government, as it was in the previous wars that we've talked about over the last 2 decades and earlier, but by Russia, and therefore it allows our government to practically, you'd think there'd never been a war before the war in Ukraine, the way that they just talk about all the terrible aspects of war without any acknowledgement that they've been responsible for even worse situations than we see in Ukraine today. But it's also a key difference is that whereas the attacks on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Libya were not symmetrical powers in any sense. You know, that Afghanistan barely had an air force, that there was no real doubt as to the outcome of these invasions and wars. With the situation that we have now in Ukraine, we are talking about wars between major powers, between Russia on the one hand, and I agree very much with Paul's the way that he described the Ukraine situation, state on state, alongside a proxy war, and therefore a war between NATO and Russia, which is, I think, becoming more and more obviously the case to those who might not have thought it was at the beginning, and which of course involves nuclear powers on both sides. So this is a situation, I think, that whatever the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the world is changing in terms of what we will see afterwards. That there is, even if this war ended tomorrow, and nobody believes that is going to be the case, there would be fundamental changes in terms of the war. And therefore, I think for us, our starting point, and I think absolutely correctly when the invasion happened, was that we condemned the invasion. We still argue that we want the withdrawal of Russian troops, and we want a ceasefire, and we want peace negotiations as the only way of bringing an end to this war. But of course, we've also been extremely critical of NATO expansion, not just NATO expansion, but the role of NATO and the particular Western powers in terms of the way in which they've developed this military conflict since the end of the Cold War, the way in which arms spending and arms sales have so dramatically increased over the last couple of decades, and the way in which our government has always played a belligerent role and is continuing to play an extremely belligerent role. You know, Boris Johnson just ignores any talk about peace talks, is the most enthusiastic in sending even more weapons, and is now sending tanks via Poland to Ukraine, and more is being poured in. Now, what does this mean in terms of the situation? Firstly, it means a huge shift worldwide towards militarism, and particularly we're going to see Europe transformed in terms of the way in which there's military spending, and the way, particularly in countries like Germany, where this becomes a much more central part of what they are doing. We're going to see further expansion of NATO. We're already seeing the new Cold War with China. We're seeing the world dividing into blocks, and again, this will be something that we'll be continuing. We're also seeing ideological and economic attacks on working class people in this country and elsewhere that we're expected to pay for the war that is going on. If you look at one of the commentators on the Today programme the other morning, we have to be prepared for war. We have to prepare the British people for war. Now, actually, our country has been involved in wars, as we know, for decades, but of course, those were against black and brown people in countries far away. Now we're being told that the prospect of much greater war in Europe and the prospect of even possibly the use of nuclear weapons is something which is a real possibility. Countries like Germany are being told they have to expect to pay the price. In other words, it'll be more money that goes from public spending on things that we need towards the military and towards the defense. And all of these things are going on all the time. So we're seeing all of these different things. And of course, we're looking at a political situation in this country where it's not just bipartisan. Every MP in the British Parliament, apart from Jeremy Corbyn, who, as people know, has lost the Labour whip and now sits as an independent, I think it's fair to say, with the exception of Sinn Féin, who don't sit in the British Parliament, but who have a good position on this, I think it's fair to say that all of them are essentially accepting the government agenda. Keir Starmer, as we know, demanded that 11 Labour MPs withdrew their name from a statement that was issued before the war started. Unfortunately, they all agreed to do that, which has weakened certainly the parliamentary opposition, but has also made things more difficult, I think, for us generally. And what Starmer is effectively saying is you cannot anymore criticise NATO past, present or future, whatever they do. Now, this is an absolutely unacceptable position for any Labour Party to take in a supposed democracy. And it's one which is having an impact in all sorts of ways. So I think all of this is a real challenge for us. But I just want to conclude by saying two things which I think are more in our favour. And I think that the points that previous speakers have made are very important, that we have to continue to campaign and organise in the way that we've done. The first is that while there is massive sympathy for the people of Ukraine and support for refugees and all the other things that we've seen, there is no enthusiasm in this country for a wider conflict. And I think that people are very sceptical about our government, quite rightly. It's unfortunate that Keir Starmer's allowing Boris Johnson a free pass on this particular question, the Prime Minister who has absolutely no credibility about anything, but who is allowed to posture in this kind of way. So there is no enthusiasm from this conflict among working people in this country, among most people in this country. The second and important thing for us, and I hope we will discuss this obviously further today, is the resilience of the anti-war movement. Despite the difficulties that we've had over the last few weeks and months over this question, despite the attacks on us, despite the attempts to try to silence us, the opposite is happening, that there are more groups springing up, that there are more people prepared to stand up to this. And I believe this is one of the most important things that we can do. We know Lowkey referred to Keir Hardie, who was pilloried in 1914 when he took a view about peace. We're getting some of this from the pro-war left, who seem to think that any talk about peace is not acceptable, that all you can do is talk about more arms being flooded into Ukraine, more sanctions, more on Russia, more attacks on Russian people and so on. The truth is that while we're in a minority at the moment, more and more people will begin to recognise the reality of what we say, that this is not a war which is just about what's happened in the last few weeks. This is about NATO expansion. It's about the world being divided into these different camps. And it's about a situation that we have to continue to campaign over. So I'd like to thank everybody who's here today and thank everybody for the campaigning that we've done over the last few weeks and the impact we've had over that. And let's today commit ourselves to doing more and more of this campaigning over the next few months until we begin to turn the tide over this way in which this government, our government in particular, is fanning the flames of war and will expect us to pay for it in terms of increased defence spending and attacks on us in different ways.
Thank you so much, Lindsey, and thanks to all of our speakers, Paul, Lowkey, Riccardo and Lindsey, for that plenary and for getting us started today. We're now going to be moving on to resolutions and discussion and debate. Now, I